Okay, so Dr. Dr. Jill Goldstein is our keynote speaker. She's the professor of psychiatry and medicine at Harvard Medical School, the founder and executive director of the Innovation Center on Sex Differences in Medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, and the Helen T. Moerschner Endowed Research Institute Chair in Women's Health. She's a clinical neuroscientist, an expert in understanding sex differences in disorders of the brain and their co-occurrence with general medicine, such as cardiovascular disease. Her program of research, funded by the National Institute of Health for over 30 years, called Clinical Neuroscience Laboratory of Sex Differences in the Brain, consists of an interdisciplinary team integrating brain imaging, physiology, neuroendocrinology, genetics and genomics, immunology, and collaborations with basic scientists. The studies take a lifespan approach, beginning in prenatal development to understanding the early origins of sex differences in the co-occurrence of depression, cardiometabolic diseases, and Alzheimer's disease. She's published over 200 articles, chapters, and other original and peer-reviewed work in these areas. In 2018, she launched Icon X at Mass General Hospital, whose mission is to enhance discoveries about sex differences in medicine and incorporate the knowledge into developing novel sex-dependent and sex-specific therapies and prevention strategies. In 2020, Icon was designated an NIH Specialized Center of Research Excellence on Sex Differences in Medicine. Dr. Goldstein, the stage is yours. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Oriana. I don't think I've had that kind of introduction and build-up, and it's a good thing I'm going to be talking about stress today, because we just witnessed how Oriana can handle a stressful event. Thank you very much for having me, and we had a very exciting day yesterday. I learned a great deal. But I am going to shift gears today to shift from reproductive disorders to focusing, as Oriana explained, to sex differences in chronic diseases. I will focus on the brain and the heart because that's what we've been doing for the last 30 years. But really, the kinds of things I'm talking about today really are generalizable across a number of organs and tissues. I will be talking a lot about stress and how we can think about some of the discovery work we have done around the circuitry that regulates stress, and how that journey has taken us into development of sex-dependent therapeutics. To give you some examples of how this is done. And then I will talk a little bit about the Innovation Center on Sex Differences in Medicine. As Oriana said, we fondly call it Icon X. I have just one disclosure. I'm on the Scientific Advisory Board and have some equity interest in CalaHealth, which is a neuromodulation company. There's absolutely no conflict of interest with what I'm going to present today. Okay, here we go. So stress affects every chronic disease we know. And one of the reasons for that is that it impacts multiple pathways. It's regulated by the brain, but it also impacts our hormonal functions. It impacts cardiac, vascular, metabolic, and it impacts immune function. And finally, of course, it impacts behavior, anxiety, depression, substance use, our appetites. And so it has pervasive effects across multiple systems, and therefore it can tell us something about when these systems go awry that are related to the pervasive sex differences we see across chronic disease. This is just a smattering of some examples of diseases. Women have higher rates of anxiety disorders and depression, almost twofold. Cardiovascular disease, overall higher rates in men, but we know it's the #1 killer of women in the United States and in most middle-income countries. And of course, post-menopause, those rates in women actually begin to equal the rates in men. Diabetes, we see sex differences. Almost all of the autoimmune disorders like rheumatoid arthritis, we'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. And also women have a higher frequency of Alzheimer's disease. And we know now it's not only because women live longer. So we need to understand what are the causes of some of these sex differences, how can we approach understanding those causes, and then how can we translate them into the development of what we are calling sex-dependent diagnostic tools and sex-dependent therapeutics. And as we said, I am going to use disorders of the brain and the heart as a prime example of this. Heart disease and depression are the number 1 and 2 primary causes of disability worldwide. We heard about what the sex differences were in those 2 diseases. And the co-occurrence of depression and cardiovascular disease was slated to be the number 1 cause of disability in 2020. And that's worldwide, so that's globally. And women have twice the risk for this co-occurrence. Women also in this co-occurrence of depression and cardiovascular disease, people who have that co-occurrence have a 3 to 5-fold risk of death from cardiovascular disease. So it's disproportionately affecting not only the morbidity in women, but the mortality in women as well. And we believe, aside from sex differences in the vasculature, that one of the reasons for high death rates from heart disease are unrecognized and untreated major depression. Now, depression and cardiovascular disease are also independent risk factors for memory decline and Alzheimer's disease. And this multimorbidity, we call it, this co-occurrence of 3 of the major chronic diseases of our time globally, we have no effective treatments for this co-occurrence. And so this is a major public health challenge globally. And we have been tackling this through understanding some of the shared causes of the sex differences that cross these disorders that have fetal origins. And we've been doing this through understanding the brain circuitry that regulates how we respond to stress. And I'm going to take you a little bit through 20 years of work, a little bit of a journey of discovery, and then how we've taken that discovery and translated into the development of a therapeutic. All right, now there are windows of opportunity for the study of sex differences, and that is when the brain and the body are either differentially flooded with gonadal hormones in fetal development, in puberty, in women in pregnancy, or depleted of gonadal hormones in women during perimenopause and menopause. And we can use these naturalistic windows of opportunity when sex differences emerge to tell us something about what are the causes, but then also to try to tackle those causes early, to try to attenuate disability and even prevent disease. So for example, sex differences in depression emerge just post-puberty. And if we had a therapeutic that's targeted to both the brain and the heart, we could be preventing cardiovascular disease that happens much later in life. And certainly 95% of cardiovascular disease is modifiable. And so if we're targeting memory decline, when we see that hypertension is emerging, then we may be able to prevent Alzheimer's disease coming down the road. So this lifespan approach for understanding causes and developing therapeutics targeted early can really help us prevent disease coming down the road. And using a sex difference lens provides some unique insights into how to do that. So I'm a brain imager, so I'm going to show you some brains. This is just a slice, coronal slice through the brain. There's a male, there's a female, and really the adult brain looks really similar in vivo. But we and others have shown that there are sex differences once you begin to look at specific regions of the brain. This is region specificity. There are sex differences in the brain, and they arise really early in development, in fetal development. And you can see here in red, it's relatively larger in the female brain, and if it's blue, it's relatively larger in the male brain. Now, sex differences in the brain, they're small. There's more variability within sex than there are between the sexes. But these small sex differences in the brain can really provide important clues for understanding sex differences in disorders of the brain. And I'm going to make that case for you. Okay, so the substantial sex differences, the most substantial sex differences, the largest sex differences in volume, regulate stress and emotion. They regulate memory, and they regulate reward circuitry that's involved with appetites, all the substances. And so we can use this kind of information to provide some clues about how to do discovery work around sex differences in stress and emotion, how it's related to across a number of disorders that we study, certainly in the brain, and then how that's related to other systems and other organs and tissues. So let's jump into the stress circuitry. Now, you're not going to remember all these acronyms, and I'm really not showing you the acronyms for you to remember them. but there are a set of brain regions. I'm going to talk about two sets of brain regions. One set of brain regions during the stress response are arousal regions. So it starts in the brainstem with things like the nucleus of the solitary tract, little nuclei in the brainstem. It also starts arousal in the hypothalamus with this little set of nerve cells called the paraventricular nucleus, and we get arousal in the amygdala. So we have a set of arousal regions. So we see a lion, we get the fight-flight response, our arousal regions go on, but then as we get closer, we see that it's not really a lion, it's a large dog, a large shaggy dog, and therefore our cortex, these cortical regions and the hippocampus provide that negative feedback. No, we don't have to run, we don't have to be afraid, we can regulate that arousal. And these arousal and inhibitory regions in the brain really regulate homeostasis because we are exposed to lots of stress, like we just had a stressful event occur, and we may have had to change platforms, for example. But Oriana's got her inhibitory regions working, and she's calmly dealing with the problem. And we do this every day. We create homeostasis in our healthy bodies in order to function. But these things can go awry. And when they go awry in disorders like depression and anxiety disorders, these regions are structurally and functionally abnormal. And there is a loss of inhibitory control of arousal. There's also, these brain regions also regulate our autonomic physiology, right? The fight-flight response, we get a sympathetic response to our heart rate goes up, our respiration goes up, and then we need to use our parasympathetic regulation of the heart in order to calm ourselves down. And in disorders, for example, like depression and anxiety disorders and even hypertension, there's a loss of parasympathetic regulation of the heart. In fact, loss of parasympathetic regulation of the heart is a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease itself. This set of brain regions that we just talked about, the stress circuitry, are converge into this little nucleus, the nucleus of the solitary tract in the brainstem, and that connects with the direct electrical conduit between the brain and the heart. So the brain actually talks to the rest of the body and the heart through autonomic physiology, but it has a direct electrical connection to the heart, which regulates sympathetic and parasympathetic regulation of the heart through the vagus nerve. And I'm going to get back to the vagus nerve in a moment because that is the target that we are focused on in the development of a therapeutic that's targeted to both the brain and the heart in a sex-dependent way. Now, this stress circuitry is really important. It also talks to the rest of the body through our hormone physiology. So it's important in the release of a stress hormone called cortisol. When that goes awry, that can have deleterious effects on multiple tissues and organ systems. And of course, it regulates the gonadal hormone physiology that also releases estradiol and other estrogens in the ovaries and in the testes, testosterone. And finally, that stress circuitry, which is really powerful, it also regulates our immune physiology. And so there are huge sex differences in immunity, both in our innate immunity, that is what we're born with, our defense system that we're born with, as well as adaptive immunity, which is how we adapt to things like exposures to viruses, and also our vaccine response. Women have actually an increased ability to increase their immune response and also have an increased response to vaccines, in fact, compared to men. But these things can go awry when the system gets dysregulated early in development. It can affect all this physiology, including the immune physiology. And you can see here as a great example that women predominate across almost all of the autoimmune disorders. So we have better immune systems, but it can go on overdrive, and it does across the brain, autoimmune disorders of the brain, of the gut, of the pancreas, and even of the joints. And so the impact of sex on the immune system is really key for across a number of disorders, including all the disorders that we just talked about at the beginning of this talk, And also even in cancer, they're talking, of course, about immunotherapies across all chronic diseases and even cancers. So the immune system and sex differences in that are really critical for thinking about the development of therapeutics. So how do we study the stress response? Well, I'm a brain imager. We put people in the scanner and we give them a task, stress task, a really mild stress task. And you can give them lots of different tasks, and then we hook them up where we collect blood so we can get the hormonal physiology and the immune physiology, and we hook them up to electrocardiograms so we can look at their heart rate and their respiration, and we can look at their autonomic physiology. And when we give them pictures, just really simple pictures like this or like this, we can look what the brain does when it is exposed to these negative valence high arousal pictures compared to these neutral low arousal pictures. And we can activate that circuitry, that whole circuitry I just showed you, just showing the brain these simple pictures. And we can look at what the brain does under different conditions, like different hormonal conditions across the menstrual cycle or across the menopausal transition. And we can see what the brain does under these different conditions that are exposed to different gonadal hormone contexts, which we have shown in the healthy brain actually differ. Even when the subjective feeling of stress is the same, the physiology in the brain is different in men and women. And that's a very important point, that sex differences in the brain do not necessarily lead to sex differences in the behavior. Sometimes they lead to similar behavior, but different strategies for getting there. And we have shown that there's a dysregulation of this circuitry and a dysregulation of this physiology in disorders of the brain and the heart, like depression and hypertension. And so here you can see these are connections between those inhibitory regions and the arousal regions. And here you can see it is not showing you, this is only showing you the men. I don't know why, but let's see if we, so the women actually showed, there was a line here in red, and it was the women that showed when depressed mood increased. It was the women that showed that there was a dysregulation of the inhibitory control of arousal, and that was not true for the men. And it was related to a loss of parasympathetic regulation of the heart. It was related to hypercortisolemia, low estradiol, and it was related to immune changes as well. And so what we see here, although you didn't see the red line here, is that in depression, for example, and even hypertension, we see that as depressed mood increases, there is a greater loss of inhibitory control of arousal in women than in men. Okay, how can we use this knowledge to develop sex-dependent or even sex-specific diagnostic tools and therapies? Well, we are focusing on this vagus nerve that I just told you about, the direct electrical conduit between the brain and the heart. By the way, it also goes to the stomach and the gut, but we are where some of our other colleagues are working on the connections with vagus nerve. But here we're really focused on the brain and the heart. And we've developed a device called Respiratory Gaited Transcutaneous Auriculus Vagus Nerve Stimulation, or for short, we call it RAVENS. This was originally developed by Vitaly Napadow and Ronald Garcia and myself, Ronald taking the lead on this in my lab, are developing it for depression and the co-occurrence with hypertension. And you can stimulate 2 points in the ear. And on exhalation, we found that that there was a greater response than on inhalation, and you can stimulate 2 points in the ear, and it's connected directly to this auricular branch of the vagus nerve. And when you stimulate those 2 points, you can activate the brain regions I just told you about. You can activate cardiac tone and autonomic physiology. And what you can see here, this is just giving you a picture of an actual brainstem so that I can show you, yeah, we can activate that little NTS there. And we can also look at how it's connected to all the other brain regions I showed you. And we have shown that it can lower anxiety, lower depression in people with major depression. It can raise cardiac tone, raise that parasympathetic regulation of the heart. And in hypertension, we have shown that it can even lower blood pressure. Okay, so that's just one example of the many things that we have launched at the Innovation Center on Sex Differences in Medicine, or as we call it, ICON X. And this is our mission is to not only enhance discoveries of sex differences in medicine, but to translate them into the development of sex-dependent therapeutics, diagnostics, and even sex-specific ones as well. It's a collaboration of Massachusetts General Hospital, where I sit, in collaboration with the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Why is it important to develop these sex-dependent therapies? Because response to treatment differs by sex. Drug efficacy differs. 80% of adverse drug reactions in 2001 in a general accounting report out of the US showed that 80% of drug reactions, adverse reactions, were in women compared with men. So there's a twofold greater risk in women than in men in general. And there's only one drug that is approved by the FDA with sex-dependent dosages, and that is the sleep medication, Ambien, Zolpidem. However, women and men absorb drugs differently, distribute them differently, metabolize them differently. We eliminate them differently. There are different pharmacodynamics in the male and female body that need to be addressed and incorporated into the development of these treatments. Here's one example, and I'm going to give it to you from a sex-specific example, breast cancer in women, to give you an example of the importance of how sex differences in gonadal hormones in part contribute to sex differences in treatment response. This Miles Brown at Dana-Farber discovered all of the estrogen receptors in the breast, estrogen receptor alpha in the breast, and the locations of those in the breast. And so you can have a tumor with the same histology or morphology, and one woman will be responsive to hormone therapies, and one woman will not. And this was revolutionary for breast cancer treatment and for choice of breast cancer treatment in women. Now, what are we doing about these things at Icon X? So on the road to make it happen, we think we can take a sex-specific effect and really apply it to thinking about sex-dependent effects in the brain, because we can localize these estrogen and androgen receptors in the brain, in different brain regions, and we can try to develop these therapeutics in a sex-dependent way that use gonadal hormone regulation as a key factor in understanding sex differences in treatment response. We're developing diagnostic tools. One is a clinical tool, a clinical algorithm for identifying Alzheimer's disease risk in early midlife so that we can prevent it in a sex-dependent way. We're using big data to enhance precision medicine by incorporating sex differences, that is, identifying sex differences in genes that are shared between disorders of the brain and the heart. We're developing devices to test drug effectiveness by sex. One is a tool that takes a slice in the gut and looks to see how nerve cells and immune cells interact with each other, and this device is being developed to screen drugs by sex. We're using stem cells to model depression and Alzheimer's disease to develop sex-dependent diagnostic tools and treatments. And finally, we're developing products and strategies for new therapeutics. One is Ravens, but there are others in the sex-dependent use of digital health and neuromodulation devices to monitor and intervene in a sex-selective way. We have a call to action, and we think it's a novel opportunity given the politics of the time, but we need sustained commitment to understanding the causes of these sex differences, to develop therapeutic strategies by sex. We need to train the next generation to create a novel workforce to incorporate and understand how to do this, how to design studies by sex, and then to analyze the data by sex. We need sustained financial support for research, clinical. We need industry collaborations. Philanthropy takes a really critical role. These projects I just mentioned, they're high-risk, high-reward projects. NIH is not funding them. We need philanthropy to invest in high-risk, high-reward projects to show proof of principle that we can then bring to these larger grant funding organizations. And we need to cross fields. We need to break silos in medicine because these sex differences are really shared across organs and tissues. We needed the adoption of a lifespan approach using the sex difference lens because we can be developing these therapeutics prior to the onset of disease, and we need public policies that are promoting health that are informed by sex and gender. We need to create the market for the use of sex-selective therapies. You, the public, you're really important in this journey. You're important because you need to ask your physicians about these things. and they will respond. So these are some of the things we're doing at the Innovation Center on sex differences in medicine. We feel this is really critical in this day and age of precision medicine, because what could be more personal than one's sex? And that is why our motto is, when it comes to health, sex really does matter. So thank you. Come join us, and this is how to connect.